Having returned from Spain, I introduced myself to the head of the Soviet Army's engineering forces, General Mitin. "What are you going to do?" the general asked me. "First, I would like to rest a little." "You will rest later. Now sit down and write about everything you saw there. It is very important for us to know what requirements modern warfare imposes on engineering troops and engineering support of the battle." That was the end of our conversation. I began to fulfill the task set before me. Within a month I wrote 100 pages. On the basis of this material was prepared a book, The War in Spain, Engineering Support of the Battle. The book was intended for official use and became a useful manual on military engineering training of command staff. General Mitin fulfilled his promise after a month's rest in the spring of 1938. I received an appointment to the post of Chief of Engineers of the Siberian military district. This confused me a little. This responsible position by the state was supposed to occupy a general, and I was a major and had not even yet commanded a sapper battalion. In response to my arguments on this matter, General Mitin said, "So what? You graduated from the academy and have combat experience. You participated in the war in Spain." We said goodbye, and I left. I started working in a large all-arms headquarters of the Soviet Army. When I arrived at the place, the duties of the head of engineering troops temporarily performed by Captain Kalyagin. We knew him from the military engineering academy. We studied in the same group. He was an excellent student and became one of the most prepared commanders of engineering troops of the Soviet Army. Meeting him gave me great joy, and I accepted a new responsible job from a friend. Before this, Captain Kalyagin was senior to me in rank, and now I became his superior. However, he was soon promoted and left for work in China.
My service in the Siberian military district lasted until the beginning of the Great Patriotic War.
The main task of the district was to train personnel in all specialties in the deep rear of the Soviet Army. For various courses for retraining were called up the reserves of rank and file and command staff. All commanders during the year were busy with intensive training. The district headquarters, which in wartime formed the Army headquarters, organized various staff exercises with commanders and staffs of units. Quite a lot of time we spent in the troops, on the spot checking the progress of training exercises and assisting in the organization of the training process. The systematic retraining of privates and reserve commanders was of great benefit. This was already reflected in the first months of the war against the Nazi invaders, when 80% of those who participated in the battles were called up from the reserve commanders and soldiers. Those who took retraining courses very quickly mastered the combat situation. This was confirmed by the experience of our district, deployed at the beginning of the war in the 24th Army, which, despite unfavourable conditions, fought successfully against superior enemy forces in the area of Dorogobuzh and Yelnya in July-August 1941. The war caught me at the command and staff exercises which the headquarters of the district held near Barnaul, on both banks of the majestic Russian river Oby. The Siberian expanses spread wide before me. Somewhere in the distance flew flocks of belated birds. Where were they hurrying to in this ringing silence? We learned about the treacherous and sudden attack of Nazi Germany on the Soviet Union on the morning of June 22nd from the head of the exercise, the commander of the district, Lieutenant General S.A. Kalinin. He gathered us and reported that this morning Nazi Germany, without a declaration of war, suddenly attacked the Soviet Union, striking a huge blow. At 12 o'clock Moscow time, we listened in the area scientist V.M. Molotov's speech on the radio about the treacherous attack of Hitler's Germany. On the way to Novosibirsk, I noticed that in the villages we passed, the situation remained calm. In the city itself, where we arrived the next day in the morning, also reigned calm, only the streets and squares were more lively than usual. In some places women were talking in groups near houses. "Did you hear, Maria Ivanovna, that the Nazis bombed Minsk and Odessa? War." Another woman replied brokenly. In the evening of June 25th, a group of responsible officers were summoned to the office of the district commander. Among them were Major General Glinsky, the district chief of staff, Major General Mashinin, the commander of artillery, Major General Mashinin, Major General Sokolov, the Chief of Communications, Colonel Ivakin, the Commander of Armoured Forces, Lieutenant Colonel Saknu, the Chief of Operations, Day, and me as the Chief of Engineers. District Commander Lieutenant General Kalinin announced, "All those present here are part of the task force of the headquarters of the forming 24th Army, and tomorrow by airplane to Moscow, and from there to the front. We will prepare the enemy a second Borino." And, turning to me, ordered take as many of your engineers as possible while the army units arrive. There will be the most work on your specialty. Fulfilling the instruction of the district commander, I took with me an officer from the engineering department of the district headquarters, Major Filatov, a good specialist in camouflage, as well as Major Slinin, who 2 months ago commanded an engineer regiment and now worked in the engineering department. Other officers specialists in engineering I no longer had the opportunity to take with me, because the sapper battalions back in March 1941 were sent to the western border to equip the border area.
At 6 o'clock on the morning of June 26th, we all gathered at the airfield. There were no farewellers.
With the families said goodbye quietly. Go, my dear, beat the furious enemy, and come back alive and well with victory. That was how mothers parted with their sons, wives with their husbands. Our wives and children saw us off with the same wishes. The airplane gained altitude and headed west. A majestic panorama of immense Siberian expanses opened under us. A thick carpet of coniferous and deciduous forests of Siberian taiga was soon replaced by the high Ural Mountains. Here we saw large factories of heavy industry of the Soviet country. Then the great Russian river Volga silvered below, and late in the evening we arrived in Moscow. On June 27th, Lieutenant General Kalinin and Major General Glinsky received from the General Staff of the Soviet Army the task for the task force it was to move to the area west of the city of Vyazma, and before the arrival of army units and formations to begin with the help of the local population to build a rear defensive line. After receiving the task in the General Staff, the commanders of the branches of troops had to appear in the appropriate departments to clarify the tasks by specialty. I went to the head of engineering troops, Lieutenant General Kotlyar. With Leonty Zakharovich Kotlyar we met back at the academy, where he taught and was the head of the course. Of medium height, with an oblong face and shrewd eyes, Kotlyar had a sharp mind and sometimes made jokes full of sarcasm. At this meeting there was no time for personal conversations, and by his appearance it was felt that Leonty Zakharovich very tired, as well as everyone with whom we met then in the General Staff in these few days since the beginning of the war. They had to do a tremendous amount of work. I briefly reported to the General the task received by the Army. "Are you clear about the task?" he asked. "Clear, but there are a few unknowns." "Such as what?" He approached me. First I began, "The labour we hope to get from the local population will not be enough. Secondly, where will we get the tools? And thirdly, the Army has no engineer sapper units. You know, Comrade General, that back in March all the engineer battalions from the district were sent to the western border for defence construction." Lieutenant General Kotlyar replied to all this as follows. "Regarding manpower, use the local population. Instructions on the party line and on the line of Soviet power to the districts have been given. The forces of the local population are really insufficient, but measures are being taken, and young people from Moscow higher educational institutions will be sent to you. Regarding tools, the local population should use their own instruments, and those who will arrive from Moscow and other cities will be supplied by us. At your request, we will send you mines and barbed wire. The question of sapper battalions is more complicated. Your engineer units, as well as many others, participated in the first battles on the border. Their fate is unknown now. New ones are being formed. Later, if possible, we will give you 1 or 2 engineer sapper battalions. These are our real possibilities," the General finished and added, "Is it clear?" The situation was clear to me, but for some reason I got out quite a naive question. "What other instructions?" Such a familiar, friendly smile appeared on the General's face. "What other instructions? You graduated from the academy, you have combat experience in Spain, so act." And holding out his hand to me, he said goodbye. We received topographic maps, instructions about the upcoming work and transportation in the General Staff of the Soviet Army. Our small task force headquarters of the 24th Army early in the morning of June 29, 1941, arrived in the area west of the city of Vyazma. The troops covering the western direction fought fierce battles with a superior several times the enemy in areas west of the railroad Veliki Luki Viti Bebsk-Mogolav. The task before the task force was to organize and with the help of the population to build a rear defensive line with the front line running along the line Silizharovo, Olenino, the upper course of the Dnieper River, Dorogodozh and Yelnya. On this huge front 250 kilometers wide, it was necessary to dig a continuous anti-tank ditch and prepare defensive positions, building wood and earth firing points, trenches and communication lines for the units and formations, which at that time were formed in Siberia, loaded into trains and moved to the front. 25 kilometers east of the first position was to build in the same way the second defensive line. The population of villages and towns, organized by the party, armed with picks and shovels, flocked to the construction of defensive lines. Young conscripts, women and girls worked. A few days later, reinforcements began to arrive from Moscow, Voronezh and other cities by automobiles and trains. Young conscripts, students of higher educational institutions, girls from towns and villages. They arrived in organized, large groups headed by engineers and construction technicians. Some groups represented entire construction organizations, such as the Moscow Water Supply and Sewerage Company. Teams from many other civilian organizations also arrived. By July 10th, more than 120,000 people were concentrated, distributed and worked at construction sites on the huge defensive line. Many of them were not familiar with construction, never engaged in heavy physical labor. It was necessary to dig an anti-tank ditch several hundred kilometers long, hundreds of kilometers of trenches and passages, and only for the preparation of 1 linear meter of the anti-tank ditch the builders had to remove 16 cubic meters of soil with double transfer. To fulfill this incredibly heavy task, people selflessly worked 10 to 12 hours a day. Enveloped by high patriotic impulse, everyone realized that they were defending the socialist motherland with their labor. In the first days, on the hands of girls formed bloody calluses, but even with bandaged hands they did not leave their workplaces. "Why don't you rest?" I asked. "We have not yet fulfilled the daily quota," they answered. "Where will the fighters stand when the fighting with the fascists starts here?" Every now and then enemy reconnaissance planes appeared in the sky. They photographed the defensive structures being erected and scattered leaflets praising the German army and grossly slandering the Soviet Union. Some of the leaflets contained vulgar taunts and threats against women. The builders destroyed the fascist libels with angry indignation and chiseled the hard earth with redoubled energy. However, fascist aviation was not limited to reconnaissance flights and scattering propaganda leaflets. On July 16, 1941, after the capture of Smolensk, fascist fighters began firing machine guns at the construction workers. In an attempt to bring disorder into the ranks of young builders, the Nazis threw saboteurs, spies and whole sabotage groups into our front rear. However, Soviet young men and girls caught and exposed the saboteurs, and the heroic work on the construction of the defensive frontier continued. After July 15th, from distant Siberia began to arrive formations of our army. They immediately occupied the combat positions allotted to them. However, the enemy was also approaching. In the area of the railway line Yartsevo-Dukovshchina, 50 kilometers west of the defensive line under construction, the 19th and 20th Armies were already engaged in fierce fighting with the superior forces of the 3rd Tank Group of the enemy. South of the 3rd Panzer Group was the 4th German Panzer Group, in the direction of the town of Yelny against the left flank of our defensive line, which was gradually occupied by units of the 24th Army. Having a great superiority in manpower and equipment, the Nazis managed to cut into our defense and captured the town of Yelnya. The so-called Yelnya Bulge was formed, but Siberian divisions of the first echelon of the 24th Army stopped the further offensive of the enemy and forced him to go to the defense. Many of our divisions were still moving in railroad echelons to the front. It happened that some of them had to enter the battle immediately after unloading at stations located in close proximity to the battlefield. During the whole August, the army, gradually increasing its forces, fought heavy defensive battles, constantly counterattacking the enemy, and by the end of the month, having made 2 flank counterattacks, defeated the Germans and on September 6th liberated the city of Yelnya. It was one of the first cities liberated by the Soviet army from the German invaders. The battles were fought only a few kilometers away from the builders. North of the town of Dorogobuz, on the second defensive line, the hard work continued. In the first days of October, the enemy concentrated large forces and launched a general attack on Moscow. The builders were ordered to withdraw to the east. They withdrew in an organized manner and, using the experience of defensive construction, actively involved in the construction of defensive positions around Moscow. Many girls from the construction teams voluntarily remained in the ranks of the active army. Having finished various military courses, they became orderlies, nurses, telephonists, telegraphers, and regulators. They could be met later on all fronts. Collective farmers and workers from Smolensk and Moscow region, students of Moscow and Voronezh universities honorably fulfilled their duty to the motherland. With their heroic labor, they helped the Soviet army to stop the attack of Hitler's hordes on Moscow. In fierce defensive battles, on the outskirts of Moscow, the Soviet troops exhausted the selected German fascist units and formations. At the same time, the Soviet command was concentrating reserves and preparing the defeat of the shock grouping of German fascist troops aimed at Moscow. In early October, the enemy launched a major offensive in the strip of the 24th Army, which was part of the reserve front, which was then commanded by Marshal Budny. The forces of the attackers were several times superior to ours. In manpower, the enemy had a superiority of 3.2 times, in tanks 8.5 times, in artillery 7 times. Despite the heroic resistance of our units in bloody battles, Hitlerites surrounded south of Vyazma 4 Soviet armies, including the 24th. The ring of encirclement turned out to be large, and we learned about it from the received order for an organized withdrawal from the encirclement. Our small group included Lieutenant Colonel Kolchenko, Chief of Intelligence of the Army Headquarters, Captain Kolchigin, an officer from the Artillery Headquarters, Captain Sokolov, and several fighters. We destroyed all the secret materials, and after a brief meeting decided to move eastward to join our own. The Germans, advancing in large tank and mechanized groups on Moscow, moved mainly along the main roads. They did not occupy vast tracts of forest on the far and near approaches to Moscow, and did not draw their troops into battles to capture numerous small settlements. Their main goal was to encircle the Soviet capital and seize it with a lightning strike from the northwest and southeast. Later we learned that the units and formations of our army, being surrounded, fought in an organized manner, despite heavy losses, did not drop their honor. Having left the encirclement, they joined the troops defending near Moscow. Our group increased due to the fighters joining it, then decreased after the battles with the enemy, which we fought, making our way to the front line. Having got into the encirclement, we did not doubt for a minute that we would definitely get out of it, and were ready to fight to the last bullet, only to reconnect with our own. We had a difficult and dangerous breakthrough ahead of us, but we were encouraged by the knowledge that, despite the temporary successes of the enemy, we still beat him. On the first evening in the encirclement, a general unknown to me took command of the group. From all the assembled fighters and commanders, he organized a detachment of about 35 men. Before us and other groups in the area, the general set the task to fight our way to the east. All of us had personal weapons. In addition to a TT pistol, I had a Spägen assault rifle. Most of the commanders had the same weapons, and the soldiers had rifles. We moved mostly at night, crossing swamps and rivers. We oriented ourselves by compass to the east. The composition of our group was not constant, and the soldiers had only light weapons, so we could not engage the enemy in open combat. The situation forced us to search for weakly defended places of the enemy and strike him with sudden actions. Such places, as a rule, turned out to be his supply and rear units, separate reconnaissance groups. We attacked them from ambushes and destroyed them, and if reinforcements rushed to their aid, we retreated deep into the forest. For the day we put out a combat guard, so that even when the group was resting, it was in constant readiness for action, and if the enemy appeared, it could always organize an ambush. We adhered to the rule not to get into combat with superior enemy forces, except when he himself would discover us and force us to fight. Fighting our way out of the encirclement on the territory occupied by the Nazis, we had many skirmishes with separate groups of the enemy. During such skirmishes we captured weapons and replenished our ammunition. When moving we avoided roads and bypassed settlements, so we almost never met with the population. When we were going to cross the Ugra River, we asked an elderly woman for help. At first she did not meet us in a particularly friendly way, but gradually calmed down and helped us. She was an old teacher at the local high school. After feeding us, she said, "Hide now, and in the evening my son will take you across the river. This is the third night he has been walking with the likes of you." And indeed, in the evening her son, a boy of about 15 years old, led us across the river by a ford which he knew well. By the rumbling of the guns and the intense firing, we realized that we were approaching the front line, and then one day we finally found ourselves in the location of one of the Soviet units. It was the second half of October. Each of us kept our uniforms and our documents. We were sent to the headquarters of the 33rd Army in the city of Naro-Fominsk. The Chief of Staff of the 33rd Army was Major General Kondratiev, who had previously been Chief of Staff of our former 24th Army and knew us personally. After listening to my explanations about the withdrawal from the encirclement, he directed me to get a new assignment to the main directorate of the Soviet Army's engineer troops. General Vorobyov appointed me Chief of Engineers of the 5th Army, which was commanded by Lieutenant General L.A. Govorov. At that time, the 5th Army was defending the close approaches to Moscow. Accompanied by an officer from the main Directorate of Engineering Troops of the Soviet Army, I went to the headquarters of the 5th Army. In fierce defensive battles, the Soviet Army gradually emaciated the enemy, broke the offensive impulse of his tank and mechanized divisions, and stopped them near Moscow. The Supreme Command of the Soviet Army was concentrating fresh forces and preparing a decisive counter-offensive. The Soviet Army counter-offensive near Moscow began in the first days of December 1941 and soon developed into a general offensive along the entire front. Hitler's generals considered the Russian winter as one of the main reasons for their defeat near Moscow. The winter of 1941 was indeed very harsh, but the frost was the same for everyone. The Nazis were even in a more favorable position. Their defensive positions were mainly along the settlements. In villages, the occupants adapted almost every house for circular defense. In the open areas between villages, the Germans also equipped positions trenches with high bunkers made of water and icy snow, heated dugouts and shelters. Placed in this way, they fiercely defended. For the engineering support of the counter-offensive near Moscow, the Supreme High Command of the Soviet Army created an entire sapper army. Engineer sapper units and subdivisions showed wonders of combat and labor heroism. They laid columns in the snow 1.5 meters deep for the advance of infantry, tanks and other types of troops, carried out mining and demining, built barriers. And the frost reached 35 degrees. The Soviet units were advancing on the open field, advancing with great difficulty in deep snow. The Germans, seeking to delay the infantry, set a lot of anti-personnel mines and surprise mines, which exploded at the slightest touch. However, despite the dense enemy fire, the Soviet fighters heroically went forward, breaking through one after another line of enemy defenses. Hitlerites were forced to leave their landscaped positions, but retreating, they left behind them a zone of total destruction. For this purpose, they formed special teams, which were the last to leave the settlements, turning them into ruins. True, often our troops were advancing so rapidly that Hitlerites did not have time to do their black deeds. I remember we were standing southeast of Mushaisk. The fire of several enemy bunkers, equipped in a large clearing in the forest, delayed the advance of one regiment of the 50th Infantry Division. This division was commanded by Major General Lebedenko. We knew him from his service in the Siberian military district. In the city of Akinsk, he commanded then the 94th Rifle Division, which later crushed the German troops near Moscow. Together with General Lebedenko, we hurried to the observation post of the regiment commander, located at the edge of the forest 1/2 kilometer from the enemy bunkers. To the right and left of us in the snow lay in preparation for the attack the men of the regiment. On the order of General Lebedenko, on the edge of the forest, pulled up guns, which opened direct fire. A few shots and pieces of broken logs flew from the bunkers in different directions. A few more hits, and the enemy firing points were silenced. The regiment rose to the attack and broke into the positions of the defending enemy. Thus, deep snow and 35-degree frost did not prevent the Soviet fighters to defeat Hitlerites in hand-to-hand combat. By the end of the counter-offensive near Moscow, the depth of advance of our troops was not uniform, and the frontier occupied by the army was a zigzag line. In the area of the village of Vasilki, west of Moshaisk, part of the Soviet divisions deeply cut into the enemy's defense. Neighboring units on the left and right fell far behind. Both sides fought hard, striving to equalize the front line. The enemy wanted to cut off and surround our grouping, wedged into his defense. To this end, he conducted several counterattacks on the flanks and managed to significantly narrow the passage to our semi-enveloped units. One night I was checking the defense and the course of hostilities in the area where our units were almost completely surrounded. Having got to the command post of one of the regiments, I unexpectedly met here my comrade officer Sokolov, together with whom in October 1941 we were surrounded near the town of Vyazma and then fought our way to our own. He told me in detail about the heroic events of the past day. The regiment repulsed 7 attacks. The attacking groups of the enemy were constantly changing. Hitlerites, having drunk for courage, came out of dugouts, shot and shouted, "Russ, surrender." But my guys gave them a good beating. Sokolov told me. There, in front of the trenches, piles of fascist corpses. My guys are good, they fight well, but not enough of them. The regiment had not received any replenishment or hot food for a long time, and we were running out of ammunition. Supply became difficult, especially after the Nazis narrowed the corridor and began to shoot it with machine gun fire. The Army Command could not tolerate this situation, in which our 2 divisions found themselves, and was preparing an operation to equalize the front. Army Commander Lieutenant General Govorov personally visited the compounds, visited the forward observation posts, studied the course of hostilities, looking for weaknesses in the enemy's defense. He paid special attention to reconnaissance. From me as a deputy for engineering troops, required accurate data on the state and nature of enemy defenses, the presence of pillboxes, bunkers, mines and other obstacles. A few days after my meeting with Sokolov was successfully conducted an operation to level the front line near the village of Vasilki. The enemy was pushed back 15 kilometers to the west. The Soviet counteroffensive near Moscow took place in extremely difficult conditions of snowy winter and severe frost. However, in spite of everything, the myth of invincibility of Hitler's army was debunked. 38 German divisions were defeated. The enemy was pushed back 250 kilometers from the capital. Hitler's strategists were going to end the war with lightning speed. In the plan, Barbarossa said the German armed forces must defeat Soviet Russia in a fast-moving campaign. The German fascist command expected during the summer campaign to defeat the Soviet army and seize Moscow and other important defense, economic and political centers. Hitlerites dreamed of successfully completing the military campaign and becoming full masters of Soviet material resources. For the war with the Soviet Union was prepared and provided everything necessary: 190 selected divisions, tank armies and thousands of various aircraft. Everything was provided for in the Plan Barbarossa, except one: the most important thing, the heroism of the Soviet people and the power of the Soviet socialist social order. The decisive role in the defeat of Hitler's troops near Moscow was played by the moral and political superiority of the Soviet fighters over the Nazi invaders, their selfless love and devotion to their homeland, their unshakable will to victory. It was this force that forced the German invaders to flee from Moscow, not the numerical superiority of the Russians and the fierce Russian winter, to which the beaten Hitler generals, some military theorists and historians in the West refer, making excuses. The defeat of Hitler's troops near Moscow, the successes of the Soviet army at Rostov and Tikhvin were of extremely great importance, both in military strategic terms and in strengthening the morale of the people. In April, the harsh winter near Moscow was replaced by a warm spring. The snow quickly melted, the roads became muddy, and movement, except for the highway, became impossible. The spring thaw came, which greatly hampered the movement and supply of troops. At the end of May, Lieutenant Colonel Belsky, who came to me, informed me that by order of the Chief of Engineers of the Soviet Army he was appointed Chief of Engineers of the Fifth Army, and I had to go to Moscow to be assigned to another post. Many questions arise for an officer in such cases. What was the reason for the change? What would be the new position? What kind of people and in what environment would I have to work with? Most of all, I was saddened by the upcoming parting with the combat team of the Fifth Army. I was connected with these people for 180 days and nights of the most difficult combat situation. Wonderful people. To this day, I remember the commanders and fighters of a large friendly team of the army. Especially deep trace in my soul left the commander of the army, Lieutenant General Leonid Alexandrovich Govorov. The first meeting with Leonid Alexandrovich I had in early December 1941 at the Army Command Post, located northwest of the station Kubinka, 63 kilometers west of Moscow. I introduced myself and reported that I was assigned to him as Deputy for Engineering Troops. "Very well," he said. "Now go to the headquarters and familiarize yourself with the situation. Choose a time and study the engineering situation, the tasks facing your subordinate units, and their location. You are free to go. In the evening, if the need arises, I will call you." In the evening, he really invited me. The commander's office was in a large room of a wooden house. "Comrade Colonel," he turned to me, "tomorrow we will attack and take the city of Ruza. It is necessary to organize and ensure the crossing of tanks across the Moscow and Ruza rivers this very night. Prepare the crossing of tanks tomorrow by 6 o'clock in the morning." "Comrade General, today on my way to you I read in the newspapers that Ruza was taken yesterday," I said in surprise. "Ah, those journalists. They took it yesterday, and we will have to take it tomorrow morning." "Understand?" By the somewhat irritated tone with which Govorov answered me, I realized that he was angry not only at the journalists, but also at the fact that I asked a question that indicated a lack of understanding of the seriousness of the task. "I was aware that the army has few tanks, that in tomorrow's offensive operation will be only 6. I replied to the commander that the task is clear and that all measures will be taken to fulfill it exactly in the specified time. Leaving the commander and plunged into the darkness of night, I decided not to waste time and immediately began to fulfill the task. Technically, the task of crossing the tanks across the river was quite simple. The rivers in the Moscow region in January were covered with a thick layer of ice on which troop vehicles, trucks, wagons, and even artillery could pass freely. However, the ice could not withstand the weight of the T-34 tank, and it had to be reinforced. 2 sapper companies, with the help of logs, branches, and straw, quickly strengthened the ice. The next day the operation began exactly at the appointed time. The howling was successful. The city of Ruza was liberated. The invaders suffered heavy losses. When the operation was being prepared to level the front edge of the defense in the area of the village of Village, the army commander gathered at his command post division commanders. Here were present and the chiefs of the branches of troops. Govorov had visited all divisions the day before and gave the necessary instructions on the spot. At the meeting, the commanders reported on the readiness of divisions to fulfill the task. However, conducted the next day's operation ended in failure. In this regard, the same evening, all participants of the previous meeting again gathered at the command post. The commander of the 50th Infantry Division, General Lebedenko, analyzing the reasons for the failure, said that the enemy positions are strongly fortified, that the Nazis built pillboxes and bunkers, stretched 2 or 3 rows of wire fences, mined the fields. Approximately the same thing said the commanders of other divisions. Then the army commander gave me the floor. I reported in detail on what is the enemy's defense. I confirmed the conclusions of the division commanders that the enemy defense is really well prepared for winter conditions, emphasized that the enemy trenches in full profile made of tamped snow. As for the long-term fire points, I stated that the enemy could not have created them in the time he had at his disposal. Did you hear that? There are no pillboxes. Govorov supported me. Then the commander, having listened to everyone, gave brief orders on the organization of interaction and finally said, In the morning, the task must be accomplished. The next day, the operation was successful, and the front line in the area of the village of Vasilki was levelled. Having warmly said goodbye to the staff of the army headquarters and commanders of engineering units, I left for Moscow. Colonel General M.P. Vorobov, the head of the Soviet Army Engineering Forces, having listened to my report on the consolidation of the army on the achieved line, familiarized me with the general situation and the tasks of the engineering forces. Referring to the enemy's intentions, he informed me that large offensive operations are expected, and that in this connection there is a decision to form special engineering battalions of the reserve of the main command, capable of creating in a short time strong operational barriers in certain operational directions. You have been appointed chief of one such group of engineering battalions for the construction of operational barriers. There are 9 such battalions, and now they are concentrated west of the city of Ryazan. The battalions are taken from the engineering construction brigades, continued the general. They have some experience in building rear defensive lines, but they have not worked with engineering munitions and do not know them. Your task within 1 or 2 months to teach these battalions to skillfully handle such ammunition. You already have sufficient combat experience, including in the creation of mine blast barriers. I am sure you will successfully cope with this task. General Vorobyov was considered one of the best experts in mine blasting in the Soviet Army and carefully selected personnel. In the battalions mentioned above, few officers and sergeants knew the mine explosive business, and those who practically worked with these munitions, there were even fewer. Training began. 4 officers and NCOs, more or less familiar with this work, organized 3 4-day courses, and the best of them were sent to battalions. In this way, training centers were created. The number of specialists gradually increased, and by the end of June, all personnel, about 3,000 officers, NCOs and soldiers, mastered the work with training mines. In July, training began to work with live mines. Before the war, the training of sappers was conducted only on the work with training mines. Before the war, there was a rule: a mine placed in the ground was not removed, but only exploded. The combat situation forced to abandon this erroneous rule in the first days of the war. In July-August 1941, the 24th Army, in which I was Chief of Engineers, was engaged in defensive battles near the town of Yelnya. Having called me to him, the commander of the army, Major General Rakutin, informed me that an enemy offensive was expected to break through our defences southwest of Dorogobozh and ordered to mine the threatened area that very night. During the night, this area was mined with anti-tank and anti-personnel mines, but the enemy did not take active actions here. After lunch, I was called again by Major General Rakutin and ordered to remove the mines so that they would not prevent our units from attacking the enemy. I took 10 men with me and in the woods near the minefield showed them how to discharge and remove the mines. Anti-personnel mines were especially dangerous, but the soldiers worked very carefully and the minefield was cleared quickly and without incident. The mines became mobile. The mines began to maneuver both in defensive and offensive combat. In June-July 1942, we prepared all 9 engineer battalions for the construction of operational barrages. A great help in the success of special training of such a large number of people, we had a properly organized, purposeful party political work. At party meetings and during the hours of political training, party and political workers explained the tasks of battalions and the importance of the difficult and dangerous specialty of the mineral, which every soldier and commander must master perfectly. On July 30th, I received an order and a schedule with the exact stations where the battalions were to be loaded. Having given the necessary orders for the execution of the order, on July 31st I went to Moscow to the head of the Soviet Army's engineering forces. In Moscow I was received by Colonel General Vorobyov in the presence of his deputy, Major General Nazarov. MP Vorobyov reported that the enemy has made 2 strikes, one in the direction of Voronezh, Stalingrad, and the other the North Caucasus, Baku. The Germans need Baku oil. Tomorrow, with General Nazarov, you will fly to the North Caucasus at the disposal of the commander of the group of troops, Lieutenant General Maslenikov. The task will be clarified on the spot. It is necessary to erect barriers of operational scale and help the troops to close the Germans' way to Baku oil. Your battalions, said Vorobyov, will be concentrated in the same area. On August 1st, we flew south on a military transport plane. Our route ran parallel and west of the Volga, over the territory occupied by the Germans. Together with us flew 20 junior officers, replenishment for the troops of General Maslenikov. In the evening we arrived in Makhachkala and spent the night at the airfield. On August 2nd, General Nazarov scheduled a flight for 6 o'clock in the morning. In the airplane remained a few seats behind the pilot's cockpit. Others were removed. On the right chair sat General Nazarov. On the left I settled down. The officers sat on their duffel bags. The weather was good. On the banks of the Tarik River the broken lines of trenches were clearly visible. The Germans were close. On the right I could hear artillery fire. Imperceptibly I dozed off. Suddenly there was a crackling sound, and the airplane shook violently. At first I thought we had hit an air hole, but immediately I heard machine gun fire. The plane's onboard machine gun was firing. Looking out the porthole, I saw trees flickering. Someone shouted burn. Many of the officers were wounded. I tried to get up, but felt a sharp pain in my left leg. The general could not get up either, pointing to my right arm and leg. The airplane made an emergency landing on a high mountain. There were trees growing all around. Only 3 of us were not injured, including General Nazarov's adjutant Captain Kirillov. They carried the seriously wounded. 3 of our lightly wounded comrades went to look for a settlement. By 3 o'clock they returned with a doctor, a nurse and orderlies. By 6 o'clock in the evening we were accommodated in the school building of Matani village. Here now there was a hospital. I was bandaged, my leg was splintered. In the airplane between me and General Nazarov sat Lieutenant Colonel Vladimir Kadnikov, one of my first chiefs in those days, when I began my service in the military engineering school in 1925. Both of his legs were broken above the knees, and he died the next day. The village of Matani was close to the front line, so we were evacuated to Tbilisi. My left leg was broken, and they put a plaster on it. A few days later we were sent to Tashkent. At that time the capital of Soviet Georgia was declared a frontline city, and it was impossible to stay there, as we were to undergo a long treatment. We learned from the newspapers that fierce battles were taking place on the outskirts of the Volga River and in the North Caucasus. I was constantly worried about the thought, where are our battalions now? Who will meet them and set combat tasks? General Nazarov and I were supposed to organize their work, but instead we both ended up in the hospital. According to doctors' conclusions, the treatment could last a month, or even 2. Konstantin Stepanovich's condition was more severe, and he was to receive a longer treatment. I asked the attending doctor to send me to Novosibirsk, where my family lived. He was sympathetic to this request, but warned that he could do it only when I learned to walk with crutches. And so the day came when I, accompanied by a nurse, leaned on crutches and boarded the train Tashkent-Novosibirsk. On September 20th in the morning I got out of the car at the Novosibirsk station. However, I searched in vain for the face of my wife, to whom I had sent a telegram from Tashkent. The telegram came only on the 2nd day after my arrival. 15 months ago I left Novosibirsk for the front with 2 suitcases of uniforms and officers' mobilization reserve. The suitcases, together with the commander's car and many other military possessions, had been burned down the previous year, somewhere near Vyazma. Now all my belongings were placed in a soldier's duffel bag, which the nurse carefully adjusted on my back. We said goodbye to her. Here is Sovetskaya Street. With great difficulty I climbed the narrow stairs to the 4th floor. I rang the bell. My wife opened the door. Surprised and delighted, she threw herself on my neck, but then, pulling away, looked sadly at my crutches. With eyes full of tears I looked at her thin figure. How different she was from Maria Timofeevna, with whom we parted 15 months ago on the same playground. Silently we stood against each other and did not dare to break the silence. And yet we were happy. After so many trials we had met again. My wife opened one of the rooms and with quiet joy showed me a whole heap of freshly dug large potatoes, which she herself had grown on a plot in the field allocated to her by the household staff of the district headquarters. My leg was healing quickly, and soon I began to tread carefully on it. In a few days I discarded one crutch and walked, gradually increasing the load on the wounded leg. In early November, I was appointed head of the courses of improvement of the command staff of the engineering troops in Kostroma. The more confidently I stepped on the wounded leg, the stronger grew in me the desire to return to the front as soon as possible. Several times through the officers from the engineering department who came to check on me, I sent reports to the chief of the engineering troops with a request to send me to the front, assuring that I had finally recovered. In the first days of June 1943, I was summoned by the Chief of Engineers, General Vorobyov. I came to him without a stick, although according to the doctor's instructions I should have been propped up. Having familiarized himself with the state of my health and taking into account my desire to return to the front, General Vorobyov soon informed me that I was appointed commander of the 12th Assault Engineer Sapper Brigade of the RGK. This type of engineer formations was created for the first time. Their organization was caused by the requirements of the new situation at the front. Now the Germans were not advancing but defending along the entire front, and therefore used mines and other obstacles on a large scale. New compounds had to be able to quickly clear minefields set by the enemy and us, set new ones, and solve other specific tasks. If you are already healthy and want to be at the front again, go to the personnel department to Colonel Pazharov. He will formalize your appointment, General Vorobyov told me. The next day I went to the city of Voskresensk, having been appointed commander of the 12th Assault Engineer Brigade. From November 1942 to January 1943, the Soviet troops in fierce battles on the banks of the Volga surrounded, and on February 2nd eliminated a large strategic grouping of the enemy, the 6th Army of Field Marshal Paulus. After the victory at Stalingrad, the Soviet army launched an offensive along the entire front from Leningrad to the Caucasus. As a result of this victorious offensive, the Soviet troops in some areas threw back the enemy by 600 to 700 kilometers. This made it possible to put into operation many important lines of communication linking the central part of the country with the southern part, which facilitated the maneuvering of troops and was of great economic importance. After the fierce battles and the victorious offensive of the Soviet army in the winter of 1942–43, there was a lull on the front. Both sides were preparing for the spring-summer campaign. The Soviet command, relying on the rapidly growing production of military equipment and its arrival to the troops, as well as based on the conditions of combat operations, reorganized the units, formations and units of the Soviet army. The infantry moved to a corps organization. Large artillery formations of the reserve of the main command, including artillery corps of breakthrough, were created. New tank units, formations and armies with high maneuverability and great striking power were formed. In the spring and summer of 1943, after the defeat of the Germans at Stalingrad and Kursk Bulge, the Soviet troops took the strategic initiative into their own hands. The Soviet country faced a new world historical task to clear its territory of invaders and help the European peoples to free themselves from fascist enslavement. This could be accomplished only through decisive offensive combat operations, for the conduct of which the Soviet army had the necessary combat experience and material and technical equipment. Offensive combat operations required new ways of using the various branches of the army, and these changes were made. The so-called artillery offensive or fire rampart, when the offensive of motorized rifle and tank formations and units was supported by continuous artillery fire, conducted from successive firing positions directly behind the infantry fighting order. In this way, the artillery suppressed and destroyed newly revived in the course of the battle fire points, prevented the enemy counterattack, and ensured a high rate of advance. Improvements in the methods of conducting offensive combat operations, as well as changes made in the organization of the Soviet army, testified to the creative approach to the methods of warfare at that time. The result of this approach was the decision of the Supreme High Command to create and use in combat the Assault Engineer Sapper Brigades of the RGK. The combat activity of these brigades from the very first days fully confirmed the correctness of the decision to create them. They earned the love and respect of commanders and soldiers of rifle units and subdivisions, together with whom they solved important tasks on the most dangerous parts of the battlefield. Operationally, these brigades operated within the fronts. As a reserve of the main command, they were very often transferred from one area to another, where they acted as a whole or in battalions, providing in engineering terms the offensive of associations and formations operating in the main direction. In tactical terms, the actions of brigades went far beyond the performance of tasks of purely engineering support of the infantry offensive, and, it must be said, such an understanding of their role at that time was common. Earlier, engineer-sapper units provided combat operations of infantry units, laying paths through land and water obstacles, performed the work of erecting barriers or their elimination with the help of various engineering means to ensure the success of the infantry with minimal losses of manpower and equipment. Without losing sight of these tasks characteristic of the engineering troops at that time, the new situation conditioned and even approved the assault as the main way of fighting by these brigades. Reporting to the Supreme Commander-in-Chief on the formation and naming of these brigades, Colonel General M.P. Vorobyov, Chief of the Engineering Forces, proposed to call them Shock Engineer Sapper Brigades, not Shock, and Assault Engineer Sapper Brigades, clarified Stalin. The entire combat path of the 12th Assault Engineer Sapper Brigade, which I commanded until the victory on May 9, 1945, was saturated with assault operations against fortified positions and fortifications of various types. Assault, as a special type of offensive, provided a quick breakthrough of the enemy's defense, high rate of attack, and having a strong psychological impact, contributed to the decline in morale of enemy troops. It is no coincidence that Nazi soldiers and officers were very afraid of the appearance of stormtroopers in front of their front and tried to prevent or disrupt their performance of combat tasks. As a special kind of troops, the Assault Engineer Sapper Brigades had several types of specialists: miners, subversives, bridge pontooners, and flamethrowers. Each fighter and commander in the brigade had to be able to master small arms, have excellent physical fitness and high moral qualities. Commanders of platoons, companies, and battalions had to know the tactics of infantry and tank units, and to some extent in compounds. The bulk of the brigade's personnel had been well trained and hardened in the process of formation. Depending on the specific combat situation in which it had to operate, the brigade was used in battalion or company formation. Very often it had to operate in separate small assault groups in the combat order of advancing infantry units. The formation of the brigade began in the second half of May 1943 near the town of Voskresensk, about 100 kilometers southeast of Moscow. By my arrival, the battalions and headquarters were staffed with officers, sergeants, and privates. Training sessions were held. A commission from the Combat Training Directorate of the Soviet Army's Main Engineering Directorate had just completed an inspection of the brigade's formation and combat training and found that the training sessions were unsatisfactory. The brigade commander, Colonel Milyav, was relieved of command. By this time the battalions were mostly already formed. Some of the officers had combat experience. There were also cadre officers who graduated from military engineering schools. It was necessary to organize combat and especially technical training. The situation with the personnel was favorable. The bulk of the fighters were young people who quickly learned everything. There were also officers who had experience in working with engineering munitions. However, with many officers had to work individually, teaching them to install fuses and then live mines. The operations of setting fuses and discharging mines were repeated many times daily. Party political workers provided great assistance in the difficult training of personnel. Deputy Commander, head of the political department of the brigade, Major Stepanidin, skillfully directed the work of party and Komsomol organizations. All the forces of political workers mobilized to assist commanders in the organization of combat and special training of personnel. The engineering department and the People's Commissariat of Defense directly monitored the training process and preparation of the brigade. At the end of August, a special commission from the Directorate conducted a comprehensive inspection of the preparation, organization and manning of the brigade, and found that it was ready to be sent to the front. The brigade consisted of 5 assault engineer sapper battalions. The 6th, the flamethrower battalion, was armed with backpack flamethrowers. In addition, there was a separate company with sniffer dogs, which were used to search for mines. On September 7th to 10th, 1943, the brigade loaded into echelons and went south to Donbass. By September 20th, it was concentrated southwest of Donetsk and was placed at the disposal of the commander of the Southern Front, Colonel General F. I. Tolbukin, By this time, the troops of the Southern Front had completed the liberation of Donbass, on the left flank, came to the Molochnaya River, and in cooperation with other fronts, were preparing to storm the so-called eastern rampart of the Germans. After the defeat at Kursk Bulge, the German High Command was forced to go on the defensive throughout the Eastern Front. As early summer, the Germans began building numerous defensive lines in depth, using large rivers as natural obstacles. The most important of these was the Eastern Rampart. This strategic defensive line ran along the Narva River, through Pskov, Vitebsk, Orsha along the Sozh River, the middle course of the Dnieper, along the Molochnaya River, and ended on the shore of the Sea of Azov. The troops of the Southern Front had the task to break through the well-organized and heavily fortified enemy defenses on the Molochnaya River to liberate northern Tavria and to reach the lower reaches of the Dnieper. By order of the front commander on September 24th, the brigade was transferred to the operational subordination of the 44th Army of General V. A. Khomenko. The army was advancing on the right flank of the front, 40 kilometers south of the city of Zaporozhye, where the front troops were delivering the main blow. On September 24th and 25, the last preparations were completed. The units occupied the initial areas for the offensive. Assault battalions, attached to the rifle divisions, disarmed mine blast barriers, scouted enemy minefields and made passes in them. Officers of the brigade headquarters and battalions organized interaction with infantrymen, tankers and artillerymen. In the rifle regiments and battalions formed reconnaissance groups, sacking groups, assault groups, including infantry, a squad of sappers, including 1 or 2 flamethrowers, 1 anti-tank gun, and in some cases a tank. During the night of September 26th, sappers defused mines and made passages in anti-tank minefields. In the morning of September 26th, after a strong artillery and air preparation, troops went on the attack to storm heavily fortified enemy positions and broke through his defences. Both at the breakthrough of the first and second defensive strips unfolded intense fighting. The Germans tried at any cost to hold the last line, covering the Crimea and their Crimean grouping. Wonders of heroism showed sappers as when breaking through the front line and when fighting deep in the enemy's defence. Acting as part of assault groups, they skillfully approached the firing points with flamethrowers, blinded the embrasures of bunkers and destroyed enemy fortifications with bundles of grenades. Before the offensive units of the 44th Army received replenishment. True, the replenishment came from newly liberated areas and did not have combat experience and appropriate military training. The unit, in which such fighters were the majority, could not withstand the counterattack of the enemy. To their rescue came units from the 56th Assault Engineer Battalion, headed by Lieutenant Antonina Korkina, who blocked the enemy's way. Obeying the will of the lieutenant, the soldiers repulsed the enemy counterattack. Soldiers and commanders of the brigade, with honour, withstood the first battle, showing mass heroism. For their bravery during the offensive in the 44th Army Strip, 177 soldiers and commanders of the brigade were awarded government decorations. Not yet finished fighting on the right flank of the front, and the brigade was ordered by the commander to relocate to the area of Melitopol. On the night of October 15th, the brigade units were withdrawn from the combat order of the 44th Army and concentrated in the area of the villages of Tiefenbrunn, Sladkaya Valka and Mali Tokmak. In this area they loaded on cars and moved southward in a column of battalions towards Melitopol. The march was normal. The road was a profiled highway, but without hard surface. In dry time the movement on such a road was easy, but when it rained the roadway became muddy, which immediately hampered the movement. And it happened that when the first columns were approaching the city, it rained. The cars began to slip and stop. Forward movement was not only stalled, but for some columns it became impossible. At one intersection 2 columns met, and the movement came to a complete halt. The city was close, but the houses were not yet visible, because they were covered by high rises. Artillery firing could be heard very close by, and numerous clouds of smoke from shell bursts were rising into the sky above the city. Suddenly I heard a voice behind me. "Who is the commander of this unit?" I turned around. A tall, slender colonel was walking towards me, and 10 meters away there was a car in which a large, full man with eyes swollen from insomnia was sitting next to the driver. It was Colonel General F.I. Tulbukin. "Comrade General," I reported, "the 12th Assault Engineer Brigade is on the march to the city of Melitopol. The brigade commander is Colonel Pavlov. Hurry up, Comrade Colonel. There is heavy fighting in the city. The situation is tense. Your help is very much needed there now," said General Tulbukin. "We are in a hurry, Comrade General, but the vehicles have failed." General Tulbukin called a senior officer of the Motor Transport Service. The conversation with him was short. "Immediately continue the movement." On the fulfillment of the task report to the front headquarters, said the commander, and left. The chauffeurs took out chains and began to put them on the rear wheels. By this time the rain had stopped. Soon the columns continued to move. It was getting evening. Having overtaken the columns, I went to the northeastern outskirts of the city. Here I met with the head of engineering troops of the 51st Army, Colonel Vasilchikov, who had already drawn up a plan for the distribution of assault units to divisions. With him were also officers from the respective divisions, who were to receive and conduct the sappers to their destination. Assault battalions arrived gradually. This gave Colonel Vasilchikov the opportunity to briefly familiarize the commanders with the situation, and I to give them combat tasks. Having distributed the battalions in places, Colonel Vasilchikov and I went to the Army Command Post. We went to the commander of the 51st Army, General G. Kreiser, one of the first military leaders who in 1941 received the title of Hero of the Soviet Union. He was a tall, large, broad-shouldered man with thick black hair, black eyes, and a broad, swarthy face. I reported that the 12th Assault Engineer Brigade had arrived at his disposal. "I know. General Tulbukin, the front commander, was here. He praised your brigade for its actions in the battles on the right flank of the front," said General Kreiser. Then he familiarized me with the situation and the nature of the battle in the city. The city of Melitopol is a district center of the Zaporozhye region of the Ukrainian SSR. Before the war, it had 75.5 thousand people. Industry began to develop rapidly after the October Revolution. Taking into account the important economic and above all military strategic importance of Melitopol, the enemy turned it into one of the strongest strongholds of its defense on the southern section of the eastern shaft. On the approaches to the city from the south, east and north, explained General Kreiser, in advance was equipped with a strong defensive line with anti-tank ditches, mine and other barriers. All this we have overcome. Now we are fighting inside the city, which is also heavily fortified. The occupants have adapted and strengthened all the buildings convenient for defense. On squares, intersections and squares dug tanks. From the tanks and firing points located in the buildings, the enemy crossfires all squares and streets. He has new powerful tanks Tiger and Panther. It is very difficult for our anti-tank artillery to fight these tanks in the conditions of the city. I think your sappers can and should help us, General Kreiser finished. Brief, intelligent, business-like instructions of the Army commander helped me to quickly orient myself in the situation. When assigning tasks to battalion commanders and brigade headquarters, I used my combat experience gained in Madrid. I spoke about the need to pay special attention to the flank fire of the enemy, mainly conducted from the corner buildings of the streets, and the multi-layered nature of the fire, suggesting how to attack the nodal points of resistance in the street battles, emphasized how important to take into account the factor of surprise in the fight against enemy tanks and the skillful use of mine bottles with incendiary mixtures. Then began the hard, difficult work of managing the battle of the brigade to establish and maintain close cooperation with infantry, tank and artillery formations and units. This was all the more necessary because the fighting was in full swing, and, in addition, the brigade for the first time had to fight in the city, turned by the Germans into a powerful stronghold for a long and stubborn resistance. A branched system of trenches, deep passages, a large number of places equipped for firing points, allowed the enemy to constantly maneuver forces and firepower during the battle. In depth, the Germans built the defense in such a way that when the first line was broken through, the next one was an independent frontier with covered flanks. A great role in supporting the defending enemy was played by mobile firepoints, tanks and self-propelled artillery units, which appeared in the most threatened areas of the battle, and sometimes in significant numbers. In addition, the Nazis used tanks and Sauer as stationary firing points, burying them in the ground, about what General Kreiser had already warned us. Elimination of Melitopol resistance node would have destroyed the entire German defence from the Dnieper to the Sea of Azov, as after this boundary south of the Dnieper stretched a flat terrain on which the enemy would have nowhere to get a grip. In this sense, the mastery of the fortress city of Melitopol was of great importance for the defeat of the southern group of the Germans. The fighting to liberate Melitopol continued from October 16th to October 23rd. Battalions of the brigade, acting in the fighting order of 4 motorized rifle divisions, showed excellent training, ingenuity, agility. The personnel of the brigade showed massive heroism and honorably fulfilled all combat tasks. Fighting in the city of Melitopol, as street fighting in general said in a report of the brigade headquarters, broke up into a series of fighting small groups. The sappers attackers were included in all these groups, and by their excellent preparation, training, the fearlessness and resourcefulness maintained high morale and spirits among the rest of the fighters. The actions of sappers attackers caused general admiration. All army commanders asked the same question: where do you get such people? Panzerniki sappers were nicknamed because they first wore special breast shields made of sheet steel to protect the chest and abdomen from bullets and shrapnel during combat. We used these shields in the first battles for Zaporozhye and Melitopol, but soon enough we were convinced of their weak effectiveness and stopped wearing them. In addition, the shells slowed down the movement of fighters, hindered maneuverability, did not allow to make swift strikes at the decisive moment of the battle. After the first battles they disappeared irretrievably, only the nickname remained. For the defence of the city, the German command allocated large groups of tanks, Tiger and Panther, and self-propelled units. They travelled around the city and strong fire hampered the advance of our units. The enemy tanks, with the support of machine gunners, carried out frequent surprise counterattacks on our flanks, trying to encircle and destroy our units, wedged into the enemy defence. To immediately cover the flanks of such units required high efficiency in setting minefields. The success of the battle depended on how quickly the anti-tank defence was created, that is, installed anti-tank minefields. Mines were on a strict account, they were in short supply, and the available ones had to be used with maximum effect. This led to multiple movements during the day anti-tank mines from one place to another. For example, from October 16th to October 22nd, the average turnover for each mine was at least 5 times. Quick manoeuvring during the installation of minefields in the battles for Melitopol allowed a small number of mines to create tangible obstacles to enemy tank attacks. Mine barriers were quickly placed and quickly removed for the passage of our equipment and troops, as well as quickly moved to a new place in accordance with the requirements of the situation. The enemy had the impression that the whole city was completely mined. Such operational mining disoriented the enemy and constrained his actions. A small number of groups for mines and mine clearance allowed to carry out this difficult and dangerous work secretly. The use of mobile groups of miners, tank hunters in street battles gave extremely valuable results. Anti-tank mines became an active means of offensive combat. Advancing in the infantry fighting order in close cooperation with artillery and tanks, sappers helped to capture fortified points and quarters of the city with minimal losses of manpower and military equipment. On October 19th, a threatening situation was created on the offensive site of the 550th Regiment of the 126th Gorlovka Rifle Division of Major General Kazartsev. A group of enemy tanks with a flank attack cut off the regiment headquarters and 1 battalion. Not far from this place was an assault group of mobile mines. In its composition was Sergeant Nikolai Fedorovich Sosin. Disregarding the danger, he stealthily headed towards the 4 German Tigers moving along the street. At the moment when the tank stopped for a shot, Sosin put a mine under its track. Thus Sergeant Sosin blew up 2 tanks and destroyed their crews. 2 other tanks were blown up when they hit a minefield. Thanks to the heroic feat of Sergeant Sosin, the danger of encirclement of the regiment headquarters was eliminated. For courage and heroism in the fight, against the German invaders, Sergeant Sosin NF was awarded the title of Hero of the Soviet Union. The sappers also performed a feat in the offensive line of the 315th Infantry Division of Major General Kuropatenko, when 4 German tanks buried in the ground stopped the regiment's advance on the left flank by crossfire. A special assault group was formed to eliminate the enemy tanks, which tried to destroy them on the night of October 18th. However, it did not succeed, because the Nazis, who were in the nearest buildings, well guarded the tanks. On October 19th, at about 11 o'clock in the morning, soldiers sappers Bykulov and Sokolov, covered by the fire of comrades from the assault group, took a bunch of grenades and 1 anti-tank grenade, crawled stealthily to the tanks and managed to blow them up. An exceptionally difficult task was accomplished. Sokolov, penetrated by enemy bullets, fell to the death of a hero. Heavily wounded Company Commander Bykulov was carried from the battlefield by comrades. Sappers Rishikov and Konko destroyed crews of enemy tanks by machine gun fire. The title of Hero of the Soviet Union was also awarded to the commander of the 60th Assault Engineer Sapper Battalion, Captain Lazar Iosifovich Serpa. In his award list, it is written Captain Serpa's assault battalion in the battles for Melitopol showed examples of heroism and ability to fight. With minimal losses, Sapper's assault battalion of Captain Serpa, accompanying the infantry fighting order, in the battles for the city of Melitopol destroyed 12 fire points, stormed 2 fortified buildings, and destroyed their fascist garrisons, blew up 12 German tanks on mines, including 6 tanks Tiger. Skillfully organized actions that, covering with minefields the advancing 91st, and then 126th Rifle Divisions, Captain Serpa reliably ensured methodical advancement of the division's units. So fought soldiers and other sapper battalions of the brigade, organized in reconnaissance, assault groups and groups of mobile mines, in close cooperation with the infantry and other branches of the army. The sappers helped the advancing units and formations to seize the city quarters. On October 23rd, the whole city was liberated from the Nazi occupants. Management of the brigade during all the battles was carried out by its headquarters under the leadership of Chief of Staff, Lieutenant Colonel Dmitry Sergeyevich Borisov. From the brigade command post, we used the entire communication network of the 51st Army headquarters to guide the battalions. In addition, an officer was sent to each battalion from the brigade headquarters, who regularly reported on the situation and transmitted all requests of the respective battalion. After the organization of interaction between the brigade headquarters and the 51st Army headquarters, my deputy on political part, the head of the brigade political department, Lieutenant Colonel Stepanidin, and I spent most of the time at the command posts of the 315th, 91st, 126th, and other rifle divisions, in which our assault engineer sapper battalions were operating. Here on the spot, all the important issues of interaction with infantry, tanks and artillery arising in the process of battle to capture individual strongholds and resistance nodes of the enemy and to repel his counterattacks were solved. Active, comprehensive party political work among the personnel played a significant role in the successful fulfillment of the brigade's tasks to capture the city of Melitopol. After receiving the order to storm Melitopol, the political department of the brigade under the leadership of Lieutenant Colonel Stepanidin developed explanatory work, emphasizing the importance of eliminating this node of enemy resistance. The political department instructed the deputy battalion commanders on the political part and company party committees to immediately check the readiness of communists and Komsomol members to fulfill the assigned tasks. When deploying communists and Komsomol members for the upcoming battles, special attention was paid to the staffing of assault and demolition groups. Officers of the political department and battalion deputies assigned communists and Komsomol members to the most important areas of the battlefield, and, having deployed mass political work, inspired the personnel to heroic feats in the battle for the possession of the city. In the 60th Separate Assault Engineer Sapper Battalion held a party meeting, at which the battalion party leader Sneshko explained to the communists the situation in the area in front of the Batalshkalion, the combat task of the battalion and individual companies. Speaking about the tasks of the communists, he said, "We fought bravely as part of the 44th Army. We will not shame the honor of our weapons, and in the upcoming battles, as part of the 51st Army. We will fulfill the tasks assigned to us to liberate Melitopol with honor. In the battles for Melitopol distinguished mainly communists and Komsomol members. Fighting stubbornly and courageously, they showed a worthy example to all other fighters. Despising death, they raised the masses to the feet. Candidate for the All-Union Communist Party of Bolsheviks. Platoon commander of the 60th Battalion Lieutenant Goroditsky, with a group of soldiers, destroyed 3 firing points and hit 1 enemy tank. Candidate member of the All-Union Communist Party of the People's Commissariat of Communism, destroyed 2 enemy tanks and 4 bunkers. Partog of the 3rd Company Chernenko, together with 2 soldiers, destroyed a machine gun and 2 hand machine guns. Communist Drezhdy and Penzin destroyed 2 enemy tanks and 5 firing points. A member of the All-Union Communist Party, Simonenko, destroyed 2 German tanks together with their crews. For courage and bravery shown in the battles for Melitopol, 62 members and candidates for party membership and 71 Komsomol members were presented to government awards. Active concrete work of party organizations among the personnel of the brigade, high personal example of communists and Komsomol members, contributed to strengthening the authority of the party. During the battles for the liberation of Melitopol, the political department of the brigade received 58 applications for admission to the party and 41 applications for admission to the Komsomol. In the battles for Melitopol, once again, showed the high moral qualities of Soviet soldiers. Neither murderous machine gun fire, nor direct fire of tanks Tiger and assault guns Ferdinand, nor fierce counterattacks of fascists could not suspend the brave actions of sappers, who were part of the assault groups. Soldiers and commanders of all units everywhere met them as their comrades in arms, fearlessly destroying enemy fire points and tanks. In a letter of thanks to the brigade commander about the actions of the 60th Independent Assault Engineer Battalion in support of the offensive of the 550th Infantry Regiment of the 126th Infantry Division, its commander wrote the battalion fulfilled all assigned tasks perfectly. For the courage, the perseverance, bravery and organization, all personnel of the 60th Battalion is worthy of the Guards rank. As a result of selfless fighting actions of all personnel in the battles for Melitopol, the 12th Assault Engineer Brigade destroyed 20 tanks and armoured vehicles of the enemy. The sappers stormed 15 fortified buildings, and together with riflemen and other units 24 more. Among the buildings turned into fortresses there were also separate structures of the 3-storied city school. Units of the 690th Infantry Regiment for 2 days could not seize the school. On October 19th, the regiment commander Major Boroditsky ordered to storm the school. The assault group included 1 rifle platoon, 2 sapper squads, 2 machine guns, 3 anti-tank guns and 2 76mm guns. On the night of October 19th, the group took over the school and destroyed the entire German garrison that had encamped there. The assault group was almost surrounded, but for 36 hours it held the building and repulsed numerous enemy counterattacks until the night of October 20th, when the advancing companies of the 690th Regiment joined it, and thus captured the entire quarter. The railroad station of Melitopol was also taken by storm. 3 days one of battalions of the 366th Infantry Regiment fought a fierce battle for it. Hitlerites turned the station into a strongly fortified resistance node. The sapper company of Lieutenant Glukov from the 57th Assault Battalion was given the task, together with infantrymen, to seize the station by all means. Having distributed the soldiers in groups, Lieutenant Glukov bypassed the station building and, with the support of strong machine gun and machine gun fire, with grenades paved the way into the building. The enemy could not withstand, tried to withdraw, but were surrounded and destroyed. In this battle, sappers and infantrymen destroyed more than 10 enemy fire points with their calculations. The commander of the assault sapper platoon, Lieutenant Petrov of Captain Sharonov's 59th Battalion, was ordered to take possession of a 2-story white building in the center of the city on Lunikarsky Square. The building was strongly fortified. Hitlerites were firing hurricane fire from it, delaying the advance of our infantry. One of the companies of the 69th Rifle Regiment attacked this building 3 times, but without success. Lieutenant Petrov's sappers stealthily, crawling around 7 buildings, and suddenly opened machine gun and machine gun fire, and then, throwing hand grenades, rushed into the attack and took possession of this building. The regimental commander expressed his heartfelt gratitude to the brave stormtroopers who carried out the order without casualties. Lieutenant Petrov, Sergeant Yevtushenko, Privates Kobudov, Derevyano, Korochino, Okry, Spassky, who, despite heavy fire, were the first to break into the building and in hand-to-hand combat killed 10 fascist soldiers, captured a gun, 4 machine guns and several machine guns. In the battles for Melitopol, miners of the brigade installed 3,116 anti-tank mines, removed 2,542 previously installed mines, removed 6,963 enemy mines installed in minefields, as well as neutralized 108 surprise mines. The sappers completely demined the city after its liberation. Traditional inscriptions appeared on the walls of buildings in Melitopol, no mines. Sergeant Dudov written in large red letters. These words became a symbol of liberation of the city and the final expulsion of Hitler's invaders. On the endless roads of war from Moscow to Berlin, this inscription, dear to our hearts, was our constant companion, as if the last seal of victory, testifying that there will be no more fascists here, and that it was done by Soviet sappers. People, remember this. In the battles for Melitopol, sappers killed 250 officers and soldiers of the enemy, but the victory was obtained at a high price: 51 dead and 47 wounded. The order of the Supreme Commander-in-Chief on the liberation of Melitopol said the troops of the 4th Ukrainian Front, after many days of hard fighting, broke the fierce resistance of the enemy and, having inflicted heavy losses, today, October 23rd, they completely captured the city and the railway station of Melitopol, the most important strategic node of German defence in the southern direction, locking the approaches to the Crimea and the lower reaches of the Dnieper. Thus, the powerful German defensive strip at the boundary of the Molochnaya River, stronger than the German defence, which they had on the Mayas River, both in its engineering equipment with anti-tank obstacles, and in the density of saturation of infantry, artillery and tanks, was broken through in the decisive section. In commemoration of the victory gained, the formations and units that distinguished themselves in the battles for the liberation of the city of Melitopol were given the name Melitopol. Among them was the 12th Assault Engineer Sapper Brigade. For courage and heroism shown in these battles, 151 soldiers and the brigade commander were awarded government awards, orders and medals, and 2 were awarded the title of Hero of the Soviet Union. For the battles in Melitopol, I was awarded the Order of the Patriotic War of the First Degree by Order No. 6 of the commander of the 4th Ukrainian Front on October 30th, 1943. It was the first order I received since the beginning of the war. The Crimean Peninsula has witnessed numerous battles in the centuries-old history of the Russian people. The geographical position of the peninsula makes it a key node of all southern Russia and Transcaucasia. Its bays, forts and heights are covered with loud military glory. More than once campaigns against Russia started from Crimea and ended there. Because of the Crimea, which has a huge military strategic importance, for centuries there have been many bloody battles. Crimea was the last refuge for the White Guard generals who were defeated by the Soviet army in 1920. Trying to realize their invasive plans, Hitler's military command attached great importance to the Crimean Peninsula. Overcoming stubborn resistance and suffering heavy losses, the Nazis captured the peninsula in 1942. The Soviet Army and the Black Sea Fleet heroically fought against the many times superior enemy forces, and only after a siege of months, in July 1942, by order of the Supreme Command left Sevastopol, the last fortress on the peninsula. After breaking through the German defences on the Molochnaya River and liberation of Melitopol, the troops of the 4th Ukrainian Front launched a rapid offensive to the west, and on November 5th reached the lower reaches of the Dnieper River and the Perikop Isthmus. The Crimean grouping of the Germans was cut off from the rest of the forces of the Nazi army. The only narrow strip of land connecting the peninsula with the mainland was the Perikop Isthmus. The units of the 2nd Guards Army under the command of General Zakharov rushed to it, but they encountered a well-organized multi-lane and deeply echeloned enemy defense and were stopped at the positions of the Turkish rampart. The 51st Army was advancing on the left of the 2nd Guards Army. It reached the northern bank of the Sivash in the area of Cape Jijanga, Ruski Island. The advanced units of the army, with the help of assault units of our brigade, forced the rotten sea Sivash and captured a small bridgehead on its southern shore. Thus was repeated the legendary feat of the Red Army troops, forcing Sivash in the same area in 1920 under the command of MV Frunz. The advancing Red Army had to overcome water obstacles more than once, but forcing the bitter, salty Sivash Gulf with battle required a great test of moral and physical strength. In the area of Cape Jenga and Rusky Island, where the forcing was carried out, Sivash is very inconvenient for this. Its two banks are very strongly indented, and the distance between them is about 3 kilometers. The coastal strip is not everywhere as a solid ground. For tens and hundreds of meters the shore is covered with a layer of silt up to the waist deep. The bottom in these places is also muddy and viscous. To overcome these incredibly difficult 3 kilometers of the Sivash Bay in ford, it is necessary not less than 2 hours, and that under the condition of good weather and without the influence of the enemy. Soldiers and commanders of the 51st Army and our assault battalions, pursuing the Germans, forced in battle order Sivash Bay in the area of Cape Jenga and seized a bridgehead on the northern shore of the Crimean Peninsula, depth of up to 6 kilometers and the front length of 8 to 9 kilometers. Wonders of heroism were shown by sappers of the brigade, providing ammunition and equipment necessary for the landing. Hitlerites immediately launched fierce counterattacks against the landing. The retention and expansion of the bridgehead was extremely important, and therefore at the cost of any efforts it was necessary to deliver everything necessary for the battle to the units landed on the northern shore. Tension increased to such an extent that U-2 airplanes were used for transportation of ammunition. Captain Wolinski, deputy commander of the 57th Assault Battalion, said the Germans considered Sivash impassable, but it turned out not to be so. The Russian soldier will pass even where the deer cannot always pass. On the night of October 30th, 1943, one of our divisions, pursuing the enemy, with a move forced Sivash and came to the Crimean coast. The task was heavy. The troops had to hold this piece of land at the cost of their lives. Naturally, the division overcame such a barrier only with light weapons and a minimum amount of ammunition. The transfer of weapons and military equipment of the division and parts of its reinforcement was entrusted to the 57th Battalion. I was appointed chief of the crossing point and arrived on the spot on the night of November 1st. My first thought was the battalion will die. Yes, that's what I thought. 2 or 3 days of work in the water, a cold, hospital, and the end. Even though it's Crimea here, it's winter. However, it turned out, as in the saying, eyes fear, but hands do. Already about morning our ferries with guns, howitzers, tractors, ammunition, and even Katyushas moved to the Crimean coast. We were shelled, bombed, but the crossing worked day and night. The enemy was close. The crossing was in the fire zone of artillery of all calibers. The blows of the enemy interfered with us, but could not do much harm. We were saved by Russian soil, Sivash and our anti-aircraft and field artillery. The fighters were well entrenched on the shore, where there was already hard ground. For me 6 days, and for the battalion 10 were hot fighting days. The bridgehead was growing, gaining strength. The Germans were forced to go on the defensive. Having fixed on the bridgehead, the Soviet troops deployed a large, held in extremely difficult conditions battle for the liberation of the Crimean Peninsula. The greatest difficulties were created by Sivash, through which it was necessary to transfer troops and a huge amount of cargo and military equipment. In these conditions, the question of creating a more reliable crossing of the Sivash for the troops arose. This issue occupied the front command. Colonel R.G. Umansky, in his book On the Battle Lines, quotes a conversation between the front commander, General Tolbukhin, with the head of the engineering troops, Lieutenant General Petrov. "We need a bridge across the Sivash," said F.I. Tolbukhin: "I know it will be difficult to build it, but what to do? You see, we are suffocating." Tolbukhin went to the wall, where hung a topographical map of the Crimean Peninsula. "Let me ask you, Comrade Commander, what kind of bridge is needed?" Tolbukhin, who was always thirsty, drank in one gulp a glass of cold kvass from the carafe standing on his desk, and returned to Petrov. "The bridge, General, is needed under any load. I just think that you won't be able to cope with it at once. At first, make well at least to pass over the bridge vehicles with ammunition and small guns." "Agreed." All this conversation became known to me that same night from the mouth of the general himself. During the period from October 30th to November 6th, all battalions of the brigade were on the shore of Sivash. On boats and ferries we transported guns, camp kitchens, food, wagons and horses for the troops on the bridgehead, the number of which was constantly growing. I said transported, or rather to say dragged, because both banks of the bay at a distance of 100 to 200 meters to the water was liquid mud. Then there was a small strip of water, and only then the depth necessary for swimming began. Here on this coastal mud, drowning up to their waists in liquid, salt and cold mud, the soldiers pulled heavy ferries. In such difficult conditions, 57th Battalion of Major Bulatov and 84th Light Crossing Park of Captain Zikrak from November 2nd to 12 transferred 143 76 mm guns, 15 57 mm guns, 75 45 mm guns, 15 howitzers, 31 machine guns to the southern bank of Sivash, 15 mortars, 42 vehicles, 535 boxes of ammunition, 3,400 anti-tank mines, 106 boxes of Molotov cocktails, 2 horses, 1 tractor, 74 tons of food, and transported 416 wounded from the southern shore. During this time, parts of the 10th and 67th Rifle Corps were transferred to the south bank. The difficult situation at Sivash urged to build a bridge across the Rotten Sea, and the front command made such a decision. On November 5th, Lieutenant General Petrov, head of the engineering troops of the 4th Ukrainian Front, arrived at the brigade command post in the village of Zentyob and informed me of the order of the front commander to immediately begin construction of a bridge across the Sivash. I was appointed head of construction. We met Ivan Andreevich Petrov back in 1931. He participated in the Civil War and had a rich combat experience. At the academy, he was the head of our training group. A cheerful man, he at the same time knew how to be a strict and demanding commander. We all respected him very much. I asked Ivan Andreevich what tonnage the bridge should withstand, where to get materials and manpower, what were the construction terms. General Petrov answered briefly. The bridge must withstand an average load of up to 16 tons. And what about the labour force? In addition to your brigade in the construction will take part 63rd Engineer Sapper Brigade Lieutenant Colonel Poplavsky, which will arrive tomorrow. And the materials? We don't have them. Organise a reconnaissance and look for local materials. I instructed my guys to look for building materials near Melitopol. They said that there was an oak forest there. After the departure of Lieutenant General Petrov, I gathered the officers of the headquarters, informed them of the task and instructed the technical department to develop the project and the Chief of Staff to organise the search for local materials. On the same day, on a small rubber boat, accompanied by Lieutenant Glukov, I crossed Sivash along the route of the future bridge to Russky Island and from it to the northern shore of the peninsula. The most part of the strait, 3 kilometers wide, we passed on foot, drowning up to our waists in mud. When late in the evening we returned from reconnaissance, the Chief of Staff, Lieutenant Colonel Dmitry Sergeyevich Borisov, had already given the necessary orders to concentrate the units, and we began to discuss the design of the bridge. The task was extremely difficult. None of the known in the military and civilian bridge construction designs were suitable for the conditions of Sivash. The Chief Engineer of Construction, Major Duplevsky, sent from the front headquarters, and the head of the technical department of the brigade, Captain Zhadovich, made inquiries and reported to me that before the war a special commission studied this issue and concluded that the construction of a bridge across the Sivash is impossible. I did not have time to clarify the reliability of this information. I answered the officers' specialists that we were ordered to build a bridge, and we will build it. I said that I had checked the place where the bridge would pass, and I had some thoughts about its construction. I suggested that the bridge should be supported by frames, but that a solid cushion should be placed under the supporting timber of the frame so that it would not sink in the tide. I thought about a solid support even then, when Glukov and I were walking through Sivash and drowned in its mud. We could make this cushion by fastening a row of logs under the supporting log of the frame. Logs were the only material we had at our disposal. The idea was approved by all. The most important and most difficult question was settled. It remained to make the necessary calculations about the dimensions of the flat log support, which the engineers called wooden plate. Major Duplevsky and Captain Jadovnich, together with officers from the technical department, prepared all the technical documentation of this grandiose construction until morning. On November 6th, I was summoned to the brigade command post, says Captain Volinsky. Here was held an evening dedicated to the 26th anniversary of the Great October Socialist Revolution. The order of the Supreme Commander-in-Chief on assigning the brigade the name Melitopol was read out. Awards were presented to the personnel. I received the Order of Patriotic War II degree. It was a great joy. However, we gathered not only for the sake of the holiday. After the ceremonial part of the brigade, Commander Colonel Pavlov convened a staff meeting of the senior staff of the brigade. Present were also officers from the engineering department of the army and the entire staff of departments of the brigade headquarters. One issue was discussed: the construction of a bridge across the Sivash, an unprecedented case in military construction. According to science, it is impossible to build a bridge without an artificial base on the Sivash bottom. Engineering and geological studies show that the thickness of the silt layer is 15 meters. The bearing capacity of the ground is 0. However, we decided to take a risk. The basis was our 6-day observations of the Sivash bottom from the pontoon crossing. Designing was entrusted to Captain Igor Semyonovich Zemlyanovsky and me. In the evening of November 7th, the project was ready. In the morning, we started organizing the building house, and the bridge assembly was started on November 10th. The construction was carried out day and night. The traffic on the bridge was opened on November 27th, 1943. The soldiers showed unprecedented heroism: winter, work in icy water, shelling, bombing. The Germans bombed us several times a day with high explosive and shrapnel bombs. We experienced terrible days. There were days when direct hits destroyed 3 or 4 spans, i.e. 12 to 16 meters of the ready bridge. Artillery also got us, but Sivash saved us from it. The shells went deep into the muddy bottom and only pelted us with mud from head to toe. During the raids, nobody left the bridge anyway. We did not have time to get to the shelters. And there was no time. What else can you say? I heard about the healing properties of Sivash mud, but I did not believe it. And what? We bathed in Sivash until December 20th. Officers of the brigade headquarters met the 26th anniversary of the Great October Revolution with a sense of accomplished duty. Already on November 7th, 1943, the brigade units with a wide front began to build a bridge to storm the Rotten Sea Sivash. The front command allowed to use the rails of the narrow-gauge railroad Kherson-Dzhankoy, and thus solved the issue of longitudinal fixing of the bridge. As a building material, it was allowed to use logs from household and even residential buildings of the nearest settlements. The front headquarters allocated a considerable number of vehicles, which from November 7th began to bring logs cut in the forests near Melitopol. The local population also gave us invaluable help in finding and preparing building material. On the next day, unusual devices floated on the huge water surface of Sivash. These were the frame bridge foundations cut down on the shore, firmly attached to the wooden plate. Soldiers, waist deep in bitter salty water, falling into the mud, pulled the frame bridges assembled on the shore and installed them in a line along the axis of the bridge. The frame piers installed on the bridge line were supposed to remain stationary on the bottom, but they floated to the surface. A force was required that could force them into submission. Soldiers, slapping the mud, carried sacks of earth from the shore, stacked them on a wooden slab that slowly sank and lay down in its place. The sacks were prepared by local people. The great excitement on both banks of the Sivash and on Rusky Island did not go unnoticed. The enemy began to shell the builders with machine gun and artillery fire. The machine gun fire stopped only after the troops of the 51st Army pushed back the Germans and expanded the bridgehead, but the artillery fire and bombing continued until the end of the construction and later. The command of the 4th Ukrainian Front took countermeasures by strengthening air defense, and special artillery units conducted counter-battery combat against enemy artillery. We used camouflage extensively. Simultaneously with the beginning of construction of the bridge, 2.5 kilometers to the east of it was under construction of a false bridge made of reeds and reeds. The enemy artillery was heavily shelling the false bridge, and the aviation was dropping bombs on it. Constant care of the command of the 4th Ukrainian Front about fire cover of the bridge construction and good camouflage did not allow Hitlerites to guess that a bridge was being built across Sivash. Aviation and artillery impact of the enemy was directed mainly at the structures being built for crossing to the peninsula. The dam being built between Russky Island and the Crimean shore was not damaged much, and the damage was quickly repaired. In the area of the embankment, work was carried out mainly at night, and there was occupied by only one company of capped. Rostovtsev from the 7th Engineer Brigade. 2 engineering brigades worked on the construction of the bridge. During the raids, the enemy bombed mainly the southern part of the construction, and in the northern part he dropped a bomb load on a false bridge. Our air ambush of 8 fighters located near the construction was an effective air cover from the enemy aircraft. During 20 days and nights, drowning in the mud of Sivash, almost without rest worked under the fire of enemy aircraft and artillery several thousand sappers, and honourably fulfilled the combat task. When the construction of the bridge was completed, Professor Colonel Elisevich, the head of the Department of Military Bridge Construction of the Military Engineering Academy, named after V. Kubyshev, arrived from Moscow. Having evaluated the work of the bridge builders, he was satisfied. We passed the test on the most important thing: the bridge built by us provided the transfer to the Crimean coast of the necessary forces to defeat the enemy. On November 27th, the bridge was opened for traffic. Later, after appropriate reinforcement, T-34 tanks went over it. Only thanks to the labour, heroism and dedication of sappers it was possible to build so quickly, this extremely important for the defeat of the enemy in the Crimea. Of course, this required a clear organisation of work, and it was skillfully carried out by many officers of the brigade headquarters, the command of battalions and companies. The construction of the bridge was guided by several basic principles. At the site of construction itself, only the assembly of manufactured and transported elements was carried out. Work on the bridge assembly was carried out in a wide front, and the whole construction was carried out in sections, where simultaneously the work on the construction of piers and laying of purlins was carried out. The flow method of work was widely used in all links of the production process, with the division of complex work into separate operations, which ensured the sequence of their performance. Separate teams were created for each type of work, which were completed depending on the labour intensity of operations. The construction process was carried out in 3 stages. The first stage: exploration and supply of construction materials, preparation and construction of separate elements, frames and pads for them. The second stage: transportation of manufactured elements to separate sections of the bridge and transportation of necessary materials across Sivash to Russky Island for the construction of the embankment to the Crimean coast. The third stage: work on the assembly of the bridge. At this stage, each battalion performed work on its own section. Regardless of the different working conditions at each individual site, the mentioned general principles of construction remained in force. Despite the tight deadlines and harsh conditions, the bridge was reliably technically sound and designed to withstand a heavy load. We started testing the bridge by driving a tank without a turret across it. Then, at a certain distance, moved 2 tanks one after the other, and then on the bridge went tanks in full combat gear. The results were good, and the bridge was used at full load round the clock. By the end of December, on the initiative of Major General Bozhanov, head of the 51st Army's engineering troops, construction of the second crossing began 4 kilometers west of the bridge, which was basically an earthen dam over 2,600 meters long. This gigantic earthen structure was erected by the 7th Engineer Brigade. Parts of our brigade were also included in the work on the dike, as they were relieved from the bridge construction. The construction of the dam was simple. The earth, which was taken first on the northern shore, and then on the southern shore, was brought by wheelbarrows and dumped on the bottom of the sea, along the axis of the dam. A gap was formed in the middle of the dike, and it was bridged by a pontoon bridge. By the end of January, this huge structure was ready and acted as the second crossing over Sivash. It consisted of 2 dams and a pontoon bridge, about 1,350 meters long. On February 9, 1944, a strong storm broke out on the Sivash, which destroyed most of the dam. Almost all engineering units of the front were involved for its restoration. The bridge withstood the storm, which lasted 6 days, and the traffic on it was carried out until May inclusive. It helped the troops to hold the Sivash bridgehead and to realize the Crimean operation. The construction of this bridge wrote a new page in the history of bridge building of the Soviet engineering forces. Until March 10th, while the second crossing was under construction, the bridge was the only artery connecting the troops on the bridgehead with the rest of the units. The enemy systematically bombed the bridge, trying to put it out of operation. Hitler's command repeatedly reported the destruction of an extremely important strategic bridge of the Russians across the Sivash. However, the bridge continued to operate, as the destroyed sections were quickly restored by the 7th Engineer Sapper Brigade and emergency teams of our battalions. After the construction was completed, we transferred the bridge by a special act for operation and maintenance to the 7th Engineer Sapper Brigade. Lieutenant Colonel Pavlov, deputy commander of this brigade, was appointed commandant of the crossing. A day or two after that, the Chief of Staff of the front, Lieutenant General SS Baryuzov, arrived in the area of the bridge. I reported that the trial tests have been carried out and the bridge is open for traffic. "Let's drive over the bridge," General Baryuzov suggested. It was evening. There was no movement on the bridge. At this time, enemy aviation usually bombed us, and I did not want the Chief of Staff of the front to be exposed to danger. Of course, I did not say this out loud, because the general would not have reckoned with such arguments. The two of us got into his Willys and drove over the bridge. Then we left the car on the western shore of Russky Island and walked to its eastern shore. There was the second part of the crossing, almost a kilometre-long dam, connecting Russky Island with the northern shore of the Crimean Peninsula. General Baryuzov moved along the causeway to the opposite shore. I dared to express my fears about a possible raid of enemy aircraft. "It's nothing, we'll get through," said the general. At that moment, 3 Soviet fighters appeared in the air. I immediately calmed down. Our aviators knew where the Chief of Staff of the front was. We passed the dam. General Baryuzov inspected the northern shore of the peninsula. The terrain was flat and bare. On the way back, the general looked at the numerous trenches we passed by and, grinning, said, "I noticed these trenches and trenches while we were still on our way to the dam. You are afraid of bombing, but since they are near us," he pointed to the trenches, "the bombs are not afraid." The armies of the right wing of the 4th Ukrainian Front were already fighting hard on the left bank of the Dnieper near the town of Nikopol. There the Germans had a small bridgehead, and they stubbornly defended their strongly fortified positions. In the first days of January 1944, by order of the front commander, the 12th Assault Engineer Brigade, which had been freed from construction, was transferred to the north. From January 7th to February 8th, it participated in the assault and liquidation of the Nikopol bridgehead of the enemy. Nikopol bridgehead was liquidated on February 8th, 1944. During the hot days of fighting to eliminate the Nikopol bridgehead in the combat zone of the 3rd Guards Army, I unexpectedly met with Colonel Gusev, head of the Army's engineering troops. Before the war, we had served together with him in the Siberian military district. He was a divisional engineer in the 33rd Rifle Division. We were connected by good memories. We experienced many difficult moments together. We remembered how we fought the ice drift on the OB. Each of us has now travelled many kilometres along the terrible roads of war, experienced a lot. More than once we met with death. And suddenly an unexpected meeting at the front. The sappers proved themselves perfectly in the battles to eliminate the bridgehead as part of the 5th Shock and 3rd Guards armies. For their heroism, 117 soldiers and commanders were awarded orders and medals. After the liquidation of the Nikopol bridgehead, the troops of the 4th Ukrainian Front directed their efforts to the liberation of the Crimea from the enemy. Since February 15th, 1944, the brigade was again on Sivash. Part of the battalions were transferred to the 10th Rifle Corps and the 1st Guards Rifle Corps operating on the Crimean Peninsula. At this time, the enemy intensified bombing of the bridge, and although direct hits were rare, they constantly put several supports out of action. Damage to the bridge was also caused by the raging sea in February. The forces of the 7th Engineer Brigade, which supported the operation of the bridge, were clearly insufficient, and we often had to help her. By the end of March, on a small Crimean bridgehead, under the very nose of the enemy concentrated the entire 19th Tank Corps, which had almost 400 tanks. I cannot help but note that in those frosty nights of December, January and February the sappers outdid themselves. To save the bridge, they did not spare their lives. They had to work in icy water and mud, in which they could stay no more than 5 to 7 minutes. Those who stiffened and drowned were immediately pulled out of the water by their comrades and taken to specially organised medical aid stations on the shore. Others took their place. With unprecedented enthusiasm and high consciousness of duty to the motherland, sappers overcame inhuman difficulties in the battle for Sivash. However, it was characteristic for every soldier of the Soviet Army during the Great Patriotic War. In one of the cold February days of 1944, Captain Kostovsky, company commander of the 58th Assault Battalion, led a group of sappers repairing a bridge. Toward evening, the bridge was raided by German aviation. Captain Kostovsky instantly ordered spread out, lie down on the canvas of the bridge, even before the planes had no time to fly over them. As one of the fighters shouted, "Save the commander," several soldiers covered the commander. At that moment, bomb explosions were heard. The soldiers were severely wounded by shrapnel, but Captain Kostovsky remained unharmed. Many times I had to repeat to the soldiers the truth of army life, camaraderie and mutual assistance in battle, the main condition of victory. Die yourself, but help your comrade was our motto. When forcing Sivash, we missed many sappers. The Soviet people erected a monument to the heroes of the Sivash epic as a sign of eternal gratitude. On a granite pedestal on the bank of Sivash rises a huge figure of a sapper with a machine gun in his hand, staring at the place where the bridge was. The words are carved on the granite: "Eternal glory to the sappers, the heroes of Sivash, to the soldiers of the Great Patriotic War who fell in the battles for the independence of our motherland." At the opening of the monument, a warrior from the 12th Assault Brigade, Filimonov, a participant of the Sivash epic, said, "My comrades and I came here first on the frosty night of November 7th, 1943. Drowning waist-deep in water, we built a crossing. Many of our comrades died on Sivash. In the battles for Crimea and Sevastopol, we avenged them.